各位朋友你好，我是史东。在今天节目中呢，我为你请到的是一位美国学者，他是可以说是一位重量级的有关于美国外交、美国国家国安研究，还有美国的这个外交历史的一位学者。他的名字叫做 Andrew Bacevich。我在这很快把他的简历向您介绍一下。他是我刚刚提到的是一位美国的历史学家，他的专研呢是美国史，还有国际关系，还有国安研究，另外还有美国的外交政策以及美国外交以及军事上的历史。他是Boston 大学研究所的荣退教授，就他现在已经退休了。那么他曾经是美国陆军的上校，也是退伍了。他曾经参加过越战。他曾经是1969年非常有名的军校西点军校的毕业生，他同时也得到了他的硕士以及博士学位呢，从 Princeton University 得到的。在今天节目中呢，我们要跟他谈的是他的一本书，这本书呢基本上是他的很多的这个文章的收集。这本书的名字叫 Twilight of American Century， 我把它翻译成夕阳中的美国世纪。这本书里面呢有很多他对美国情况非常中肯的看法和意见。那么今天我非常高兴在节目中呢能够请到他本人呢亲自在节目中和我们谈谈。现在就把他带进我们的画面之中。Professor, let me first say welcome to my show.
Thank you very much for having me on.
The name, the title of your book, Twilight of the American Century. Why did you pick that name?
Well, I didn't. I mean, as is so often the case with book titles, this really is the publisher's preference. I can't even remember what I had suggested, and we went back and forth on different possibilities, and this ultimately was what the publisher preferred. I don't disagree with that. I do think that if there is a theme in this book, which really is a book of essays, if there is a theme, I think the theme relates to the era of American primacy coming to an end, and that end being hastened by the folly of our own policymakers. I think there is an increasing suspicion among writers, journalists, people who observe the scene, that the assumptions that we had at the beginning of the post-Cold War era, assumptions about American indispensability, about America being a sole superpower, about the world being our oyster, about everybody else coming to the American way of doing things. I think there's a growing awareness that those assumptions or expectations have proven to be false. Now, that doesn't tell us where we're headed in the future. It doesn't mean that the United States is somehow doomed or that it will become unimportant. But it does say that the expectations that we are going to be number one from now until the end of time, I think those are no longer as widely accepted as they were back, let's say, in the 1990s.
When did you first had this thoughts, this opinion about what you just described, about where America is heading?
I guess I'd answer the question in two parts. The first part has to do, let's say, broadly speaking, let's say, with the 1990s, which I saw as a period of enormous hubris. The kind of language that was being used in Washington, language that was being reinforced and reaffirmed in journalistic circles, suggested to me arrogance, disregard for the lessons of history, and it seemed to me that we were headed for trouble. And the second part of my answer to your question really relates to what happened after 2001, after 9/11, and that is we jumped into that trouble. We acted upon the assumption that we were supreme, in particular, that we were supreme militarily. And we acted by doing things like invading Iraq in 2003, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11, and invading with the expectation that we would, in short order, convert that country into a liberal democracy aligned with the United States. None of that, of course, came to pass. Indeed, as a result of our invasion of Iraq back then, we set a match to a piece of dynamite that has exploded and has caused enormous havoc, damage, destruction, carnage, not only in Iraq but in other places in the region. So it was the false expectations before 9/11, and then the hubris that was manifested after 9/11 that together, I think, demolished this notion of American primacy.
I can fast forward to what is going on today in the Middle East. Before the show, I was preparing, looking at all the news that's happening, looking at Israel, you're looking at Iran, you're looking at Libya, you're looking at what you described, Iraq. Do you think we ever get out of this? This is like never a dull moment. Every day, there's something new that's going on over there that involved or being involved by the United States.
Well, good question. I think in trying to answer that question, we have to take note of the fact that the current president ran for office, castigating these Middle East wars, denouncing them, and basically saying, elect me president and I'll get us out. Well, we're halfway through his first term. I hope it'll be his last term. We're halfway through his first term, and there's very few signs that we're going to get out. Now, he has himself said things from time to time. I want the troops out of Afghanistan. I want the troops out of Syria. But there's a huge gap between what this president says and what actually then occurs. So even though we have a president who wants to get out of our Middle East wars, there's no sign, as far as I can tell, that those wars are going to end. Now, if this president, ultimately, he will be succeeded by somebody else, it's very difficult for us to say this early in the 2020 election cycle who the Democrats are going to put up again against Trump. And I think by extension, it's very difficult for us at this point to be able to know whether or not the Democratic nominee is going to have a very thoughtful approach to the Middle East. Will the next president, if Hillary Clinton had won when she ran against Trump, we'd certainly still be in the region. She was a hawk. She's not the only hawk in the Democratic Party. So I think we have now immersed ourselves so deeply in the problems that are in this region. It really is very difficult to say when and if we will get out.
Do you think it's to Americans' benefit to get out?
Oh, I think it is unquestionably to our benefit to get out. I mean, let us just set aside. I don't mean we should ignore it, but let us set aside all the damage that we have done to places that we have invaded or where we have overthrown the government. The damage is incalculable. But let's be narrow about it and just talk about what it's done to our country. We've lost thousands of our own soldiers killed. There are tens of thousands of soldiers whose lives have been shattered, whether we're talking about wounds or psychological damage, PTSD. Nobody knows how much money has been spent or ultimately will be spent pursuant to these wars, but the number is clearly in the trillions. So that's money we've poured into the desert that could have been used for more important purposes here at home. Whether those purposes were building highways or improving schools or, you name it. Conservatives and liberals will disagree on where the money could have been spent, but it would have been spent more profitably for our country if it hadn't been wasted on the wars. So it's very difficult for me. I mean, there are people who argue that the world is a better place because Saddam Hussein is gone. The world is a better place because the Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi is gone. And I'll concede those points. It is probably good that those dictators have been removed. But we have to put their removal in a larger context, and the larger context is almost entirely negative.
So it's like replaced with what?
Well, it's been replaced with anarchy, with chaos. And there are forms of a democratic government in Iraq. There's virtually no government in Libya. There's a form of a democratic government in Afghanistan, but particularly in the Afghanistan case, that government does not, in fact, govern much outside of the city limits of Kabul. In no case have we succeeded in putting in place a government that was both stable and democratic and liberal and aligned with the United States. And the George W. Bush administration's expectations going in was that when we invaded, let's say, Iraq, that all of those things would result. Well, none of them have. So this has been a disaster of the first order.
Another rhetorical question: what do you think we should learn from that?
Well, lots. I think, and these are lessons that some of them are very difficult for Americans to appreciate because, in some weird way, we are hardwired to believe that the rest of the world should be like us, that everybody out there wants to live the way we do, that everybody should define freedom the way we define freedom. This is something that could be traced all the way back to the English colonies in New England in the 17th century and has been reinforced over and over and over again. So what should we learn? Well, we should learn that we're not God's chosen people. We should learn that while certainly we want to have, it's a nasty world out there, we want to have a strong defense. We should learn that using force is a very dangerous instrument. So often produces consequences other than those we expected or intended. So often ends up costing far, far more than anybody anticipated. If you remember, I think it was not long after 9/11, I think even before the invasion of Iraq in 2003, the then Secretary of the Treasury for George W. Bush stated that the Iraq war could cost as much as, I think the number he said was $200 billion. And he got fired for saying that because the Bush administration, their line was basically, this ain't going to cost much of anything whatsoever. And the Iraqis have all this oil, so they'll pay for their own reconstruction. I wish it only cost $200 billion because it has cost us multiple trillions of dollars. And I think that is one small example of how our lack of respect for war gets us in trouble, as it certainly has over the past 2 decades.
As an observer of the United States involvement to many different wars, do you think it's possible that most of the people who make decisions to go into war, they themselves never had any military experience?
Well, that has been the case lately. And it's an interesting contrast. If we look at the generation of World War II, of Korea, of Vietnam, many people in positions to make policy had experienced war at firsthand, not necessarily as leaders, but as younger soldiers. That said, we have to say that that experience did not save them from profound misjudgments. I mean, many of the so-called best and brightest who plunged into Vietnam with disastrous results were themselves veterans of World War II. So it is true that if we look at the more recent generation of policymakers, we might cite Senator John Kerry, former Secretary of State, as an exception to this. But I would say most of our senior national security officials have no direct military experience, and they themselves, again, haven't necessarily shown good judgment. But I don't think that the reason they have shown poor judgment is because they never served in uniform.
You know, I saw you on TV. I saw you on YouTube. I read your articles. The impression I get from the opinion you give with regard to U.S. policy, foreign policy, military policy, are you receiving any pushbacks from?
No, but I mean, the establishment, in many respects, is oblivious to outside criticism. I mean, I say outside, I mean people who are not part of the Beltway, and I'm not. You know, I don't think I would be viewed as worth bothering with. I'm not trying to. There's no false humility here, but. When John Bolton gets up in the morning and goes to the White House, the national security advisor, he's not reading the last thing I've written and saying, "Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Look what Bacevich has said." So I think I'm sort of largely ignored, and that's okay. Although I do think that, not referring to me personally, but I do think that the policy world is insular and it's insulated. It's not welcoming to unorthodox views. And I think that that's been a problem because we live in a time when the world is changing so rapidly. The distribution of power in the world is changing rapidly. The onset of new issues like climate change, just coming at us like a runaway locomotive. It is a time when fresh voices, maybe even oddball views, ought to be welcomed, weighed, considered, maybe ultimately rejected. But I think that the temper in American politics is so unwelcoming to outside views that the conventional wisdom doesn't get challenged the way it ought to.
Having said all that, do you also feel that your thoughts and your opinion is gaining ground among the American people?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Because
I mean, to me, the sad part is that the American people aren't paying attention. It's interesting that there are issues. Economic injustice, race, the persistence of racism, the shenanigans of Donald Trump and his administration. These elicit intense scrutiny, almost obsessive scrutiny by the media and by members of the general public. Foreign policy, not so much. I mean, the very fact that since 9/11 we've been continually at war. I mean, this is a scandalous fact. Since 2001 down to the young people who today are graduating from high school and therefore are eligible to enlist in the Army and the Marine Corps to be sent off to Afghanistan or Syria, were barely emerging from their mother's wombs in 2001. So we've been at war for their entire lives. And as we suggested before, who knows when these wars will end? I think that is a great scandal, and yet it doesn't really seem to gain much purchase in political circles. I don't follow all. If you have like 20 candidates, Democrats running for the presidency now, and I certainly don't follow what all of them say about everything. But I don't think there's a single candidate who says, I'm running for the presidency because I am outraged by the fact that this country is permanently at war and I want to become president so I can end that. They have all kinds of other reasons why they're running for the presidency, but not necessarily the failures of U.S. policy over the past 20 years.
One I can think of is Tulsi Gabbard. What do you think of her?
That is a good correction. I think you're exactly right. And therefore, it'll be interesting to see if her running with such an emphasis on her critique of national security policy, and I agree with her critique, it'll be interesting to see if that enables her to catch fire, or whether she'll be back among the also-rans. But that is a very good point you're making.
Yeah, my understanding is she's receiving a lot of pushback. That's part of the same question I asked for you. I'm
not surprised. Not surprised.
Let's talk about Trump. You have an article talk about Trumpism. How do you think, as a historian or the expert in history, how do you think the history is going to describe Trumpism or Trump?
Yeah, well, and it's always as a maybe former historian, and I recognize that history's verdict almost always takes a while to emerge. When you are rendering a judgment about an individual or even an event, in more or less in real time, it's a risky proposition. So let's see 50 years from now what people are saying about Trump. I can't imagine they're going to say he's a successful president, but I suspect that as time goes along, we'll be better able to see Trump as an emblem of a moment rather than a dominant figure. I have believed, and I'm certainly not the only one who says this, that Trump is not the problem. He's a symptom of a problem. He was elected president by 60-some million of our fellow citizens because they were really, really, really fed up. They were fed up with economic inequality. I think at least some of them were fed up with American globalism and the waste of our wars. I think a lot of them were fed up with what they see as a direction of our culture, and that those reasons together caused them to cast what in effect was a protest vote. Less a vote for Trump than a vote against what Trump denounced as the establishment or the swamp, and the significance of Trump. This is my no doubt premature guess. The significance of Trump is that he made it impossible, or at least very difficult, for us to continue to ignore the disenchantment of these people who believed, not without reason, that they were being damaged by, hurt by, the direction of U.S. policy over the previous quarter century or so. It was a protest vote, I think, and that's what. And it is the protest more than the beneficiary of the protest that is significant.
This is really a simple question, also a bottom line question. What do you think is wrong with this country? Here's my take. And you can say yes or no. There's a disconnection between the people of the country and the people in power. I don't think this country is anymore a country that is for the people, by the people, of the people. I think this country has turned into a country that is for the special interests, by the special interests, and of the special interests. My thinking along this line is, okay, has this country always been this way? or I just found out recently, or has the country has really changed? And when did this country cross that line, in your opinion, Professor?
Well, we have to be very careful here. It's not like, in the good old days, everything was wonderful, and now it's bad. There has always been economic inequality and injustice. There's always been poverty. There's always been groups that have been treated unfairly, whether we're talking on base of race or ethnicity or religion. It does seem to be worse now. That the outrage against these things seems to be sharper now. And indeed, Trump himself, in his narcissistic, irresponsible way, sharpens those feelings even further. But I think if I were going to put my finger on one sort of explanation, and you kind of hinted at it, is that we no longer have any, acknowledged, accepted definition of the common good. What is it that defines a good society, a fair society, an enlightened society? And what are the policies that can be implemented at all levels of government that would contribute to fulfilling those expectations? When I was young, the phrase common good, which I don't think I fully understood, was nonetheless in wide circulation. People made reference to it. And I think it's pretty much disappeared now. Now, maybe people at a prayer breakfast or in an inaugural address, but as a concept that can define the purpose of governance, I think it's vanished. And you made reference to special interests, privilege, the acceptance of privilege.
Go back to the topic of today's discussion. Would you say that's the core?
Well, I think most historians, if you ask them to explain the cause of a circumstance or an event, are going to say, well, there's actually many causes.
Yeah,
and that would be my view about the end of the American century. I think there are many causes. Yeah. So, in other words, if I had to sort of say, what's the one thing that is most important? I think it is this notion of American exceptionalism. Again, it's deeply embedded in our collective sense of who we are because we are Americans, what makes us different. Indeed, what makes us special is somehow or other, God or Providence has summoned America